Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. We're now joined, as I said, by Rob Morley, Mike Staley, and Ken Wilson. And Mr. Morley has already been a witness in these proceedings, but this will be the first time you've met Mike Staley and Ken Wilson, so they both need to be sworn in as witnesses.
Mr. Staley and Mr. Wilson, you solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given value to this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. I do.
State your full name, please.
Ken Wilson.
Thank you. Your name?
Michael James Staley.
Thank you. Counsel?
Thank you. Mr. Morley was here already in these hearings. His CV has been marked as Exhibit 7 already, so I won't need to take you to that. But I'll just ask you, Mr. Morley, to identify that you have been involved with the FRSSI model and you've been to several workshops, or at least one workshop, dealing with the implementation of that model.
Yes, several workshops.
Okay. And you are familiar with the review of the different options through the IHPC process as well as through work on the Fraser panel?
Yes, I am.
Mr. Lunn, were you able to find this?
I don't have it here. I'm just
Okay.
checking with the office.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Commissioner, we don't have ready access right now to Mr. Staley's resume for some reason, so we'll probably mark that after lunch. But if I could just identify that you have a Master's of Science from UBC in 1978, and your work was on the optimization of sport and commercial salmon fisheries in BC.
Yes, it was.
And you were a consultant to the Pierce Commission in 1982.
Yes.
And you have been involved in fisheries planning from 1978 until the present. Is that right?
Yes.
And from 1988 to the present, you have been an advisor to various First Nations and Aboriginal groups on fisheries issues.
Yes.
And from 1995 to the present, you've been a member of the Fraser River Panel Technical Committee.
That's correct, yes.
And you are a member of the fisheries working groups for several First Nations at present, is that right?
Yes.
And what are those First Nations?
Well, there's First Nations organizations. The current one would be the Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat.
Okay. And you are also familiar with FRSSI, is that right?
Yes.
And in fact, you prepared a report for this commission on FRSSI, which is in tab 8 in the binder before you. It doesn't have a CAN number, but it was prepared for the Cone Commission, and it was prepared in October 2010.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll have that marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 400.
And then I'll have your resume pulled up. Maybe we can just have this flagged that it will be marked as Exhibit 401, and we'll provide the redacted copy after the break.
Exhibit number 401.
And Mr. Wilson, your resume is in tab 12 of the binder before you. You have a Master's of Science with Dr. Larkin from 1980, is that right?
Yes.
And you've been a biologist with, or you were a biologist with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans from 84 to 96.
Correct.
And from 1997 to the present, you've been a consulting fisheries biologist for a number of groups, including First Nations and conservation organizations.
Correct.
You're a member of the Canadian Caucus of the Fraser River Panel,
Yes.
and you're a member of the Marine Conservation Caucus,
Yes.
and you're also a member of the Kosiwik Marine Fish Species Specialist Group.
Not anymore.
Okay, when did that? You were?
I was.
And
yes.
when did that? What were the years that you're involved in that?
I was involved for several years.
When did that stop?
Geez, good question. It's not on the resume, I don't remember, but it's probably 3 or 4 years ago now.
All right. And you also have been involved in the development of the FRSSI model. You were part of the FRSSI working group for a number of years?
I was never a member of the working group proper, I don't believe.
Okay. You were, but you did participate in some meetings and
Consultations.
Consultations,
Yeah.
okay. And have you been involved in consultations with with respect to the FRSSI model recently?
Well, as part of my work with the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, I received the usual reviews and updates from the department on the development of the FRSSI model, and most recently I was under contract to the Upper Fraser Fisheries Alliance, Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance, and I attended meetings on January 21 and 22, 2009 on their behalf in order to provide them with a review of the model as it was at that time.
Do I have your resume marked, or Mr. Wilson's resume marked as the next exhibit?
Exhibit number 402.
Mr. Lunn, if you could pull up, please, exhibit 325. And you see on, this is integrated fisheries management plan, one of the drafts before the final, and it sets out for the different stocks at the 50% probability level, all these different options, options 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Those options, I take it, correspond with the options that would be presented in an escapement strategy document like we have seen marked as Exhibit 322.
That's correct. That would be an outcome from that document, or from that process.
Okay, so the escapement strategy memo, which we just had a look at, and that shows the different options and the curves with different curves for the different options. Those correlate to the text that we see before us now, the different options. That translates those curves into actual numbers. So, no, I don't. Can you, pull that bottom one up a little higher if you could. Oh, there. Oh, no. a little more. Next. There. Okay, so those options would then translate into the different numbers that you see on the screen, the cutback points and the town sizes, etc. Is that right?
That's correct. I'm assuming that that table 10A is references those curves. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I could have the wrong curves,
Yeah.
but just
No,
for reference, I think this is correct. And then finally, so the draft that we're looking at on the top of the screen, and considered by the people reviewing the draft IFMP document, ultimately an option is settled upon and finds its way into the final IFMP, and that document is Exhibit 317. And if we turn to page can number 67, this shows the choices that were made for the different options, and it translates those options into the different points, the total mortality guidelines, the run size. So it shows that if you have a run size for early steward of 255,000, you're going to have the reference points show there. If you have less than 255, there's going to be that's within the no fishing point. There's a, right, but below 156, sorry, is within the no fishing point. 156 to 390, it's in that curve that shows the percentage increasing up to 60%. Is that right?
That is correct.
And then the 390 and above is at a fixed 60% rate.
That is correct.
And the rules that you see on this table here in the final IFMP, that's the fishing plan for the year that will be implemented by the managers. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So that's how we kind of move from the pre-season planning using the FRSSI model to create these curves and these options. Once an option is settled, it translates into actual numbers that will be used in season by the managers. Is that right?
That is the current process. Yes, correct.
Does that clear things up a bit?
It does, Ms. Baker. I think I was able to follow that earlier. What perhaps just sidetracked my thinking a little bit was the use of the term in-season management, to the extent that there are significant changes that appear from the run size assessment once Mission starts to develop some numbers for the managers. And I understand the meetings that take place in April and May and into June, but once harder numbers arrive and are then reviewed, how FRSSI would operate, or how these models would operate, because these are I understood these be pre-season numbers,
Right.
not actual in-season, but you use the term in-season management, and that was confusing me a little bit.
Yeah, and I apologize. I think that was confusing. I think the way Ms. Baker has taken us through this, FRSSI, well, the plan is developed pre-season. It is the plan that goes forward for managing.
Thank you. All right, now I move off of that. Oh, sorry. Apparently I'm not to move off that yet. Right. Just to be clear, where you see the run size reference points, that's telling the managers that when the run comes in 0 to 156, this is what's going to happen. There'll be no fishing. If the run size comes in between 156 to 390, there'll be a exploitation on that curve that we saw. So it will vary as it reaches 390, and then once it's beyond 390, it will be fixed at 60%. That's what the plan is for the early steward on this example, Mr. Cass?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right, thank you. Now I think we can move on. One thing I think we've established already, but just to be clear, the FRSSI model uses the 19 stocks that there is good stock recruit data for in modeling the outcomes through the FRSSI model. Is that right, Mr. Cass?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Now, is that data that is available for use in the model from those 19 stocks, the data that's been collected for over 50 years, is that adequate to provide a stock recruit relationship that explains enough variability in the data to be a sound basis for management? Like, is the data good enough for what we're using for in this model? And I guess I'll start maybe with Mr. Morley.
Could you repeat the question?
Is the stock recruit data that we have for the 19 stocks that are used in the FRSSI model adequate for the use that it's put to in the FRSSI model? Like, do we have good enough data to run this model?
In my opinion, absolutely yes. It's probably the best that you can expect to get anywhere in terms of managing sockeye populations for this kind of purpose.
Mr. Cass?
I would just add the caveat that because not all the stocks are included, there is some risk that the uncertainty described by the 19 stocks, say, may not represent all the populations that are in the watershed. Having said that, the 19 stocks, certainly in terms of abundance, represent well over 90% of the fish in the system. But just by fact that it does not include all the populations, there is some risk that there could be populations which would be have a lower productivity and therefore vulnerable to a management plan that doesn't account for some losses that way.
All right, but for the 19 stocks that we do have data for, is the data that we have adequate? For those
adequate
stocks?
In the sense of, the top 12, let's say, which have data going back to the 50s, early 50s, late 40s. There's a long time series of spawners and associated recruitments for those. The other 7 were added on, but have typically shorter time series and more uncertainty in the actual parameter estimates. But those are as good as it gets globally, probably, in terms of fisheries science data for managing.
Mr. Wilson, what are your views on the adequacy of the data that we have to use in this model?
Well, I have several concerns. First of all, while the data for the 19 stocks may represent 90% of the catch, it represents less than half of the conservation units, or half of the conservation units in the Fraser, and it's each and every one of those conservation units that needs to be protected through management. I'm also of the opinion that 50 years of data, while it may seem enormous to a fisheries manager, is a relatively brief window of time when you're looking at the long-term dynamics of salmon populations in the Fraser. And finally, I guess, my concern has to do with the variance in the quality of the data from stock to stock and the way those data are used to enlighten us about what might happen in the future. These are historical data, and so we're essentially looking through a very limited frame of reference backwards at a set of information and trying to understand how the world might work in a way that's consistent with those data. But it's one thing to fit a model to historical data. It's another altogether to forecast the future. And in evaluating harvest policy, that's really the problem we're setting the model. We're trying to understand how this policy applied into the future for 48 years will how we will manage the risks and benefits that are associated with that management policy. And I think there's a high degree of uncertainty that may not be adequately reflected in the model, although I totally agree with Mr. Cass's point that stocks that aren't modeled aren't modeled.
Right. And Mr. Cass referred to 12 stocks that have data back to the 50s and 7 with a shorter time series. Do you agree that the 12 that have data going back to the 1950s do provide a good data set for running this model, for at least in relation to those stocks?
Not really. My concern is a simple one. If you have 50 years of data and you're going to use those data to understand how a system behaves, you're making an assumption about how stable the relationships between the various factors that affect the population will be over that time period. 50 years of data may seem like a long time, but it is what it is. Is it representative of the 50 years going forward that the model is attempting to help us understand? And that's where the problem occurs, in my opinion. Yes, I think that those data, to some degree, are an adequate representation of the past performance of these stocks. Whether the past performance of these stocks will enlighten us very much about the future performance of these stocks is really at the heart of the matter.
All right, so your concern is whether we can use the past to predict the future, but in terms of looking at the data we have for the past, do you agree that it's adequate for 19 of the stocks? Is that fair?
I don't think I would agree with that, no.
Okay. Mr. Staley, what's your view on the adequacy of the data that we have?
Well, adequacy would have to be looked at in context of the purpose you're using it for. We are in the FRSSI model, or the analytic tool. As Ken points out, we are suggesting that we're projecting to the future, but I think and there's all kinds of issues about whether that's an appropriate purpose, I guess. But certainly in terms of projecting or testing whether our prescriptions on what to do would be consistent with what happened in the past, it is adequate. I agree with Mr. Wilson that we don't know what the future holds, but we have to learn from the past. I think there are some of the stocks in the 19 that have a short time period, and perhaps some more exploration as to the relative weight one should place on those versus the other ones may be a useful exercise, but I don't think has been done yet. But I would say for those that we have 50 years of or more of data, that they are adequate in the context of the art of the science that all of us are involved in.
Mr. Cass was here this morning. We talked a little bit about this depensatory effect. Maybe Mr. Wilson, you could just explain what that is again, just as a recap.
At low run sizes, the sort of standard model generally predicts that stocks will become more productive because competitive pressures and other pressures are relieved. So at low run sizes, stocks are highly productive and have a tendency to grow quite rapidly. The concern is that at extremely low run sizes, there may be an abundance of predators that eat all the available sockeye in the lake. I think Mr. Cass referred to it as a predator pit. There's a number of other mechanisms which might lead to lower productivity at small run sizes. And it's a very important issue if you're trying to evaluate the risk of small stocks and unmodeled stocks to a particular fishing regime, and evaluate that risk in the context of the probability of extinction. So it's quite a critical assumption, and we really have very little data to help enlighten us.
And does the FRSSI model take into account that depensatory effect? I think you touched on this earlier, Mr. Cass. Is there anything you want to add to what you said earlier before I turn it over to the other members?
No, I mean, Mr. Commissioner, the model has, a knob in the model that you can adjust what assumptions you want to make about depensatory mortality. It doesn't estimate depensatory mortality. It's just a way of exploring the effect that it may have on the outcome of the model.
And Mr. Wilson, are you satisfied with the way the depensatory effect is treated in the model as described by Mr. Cass?
Well, I think it would be very helpful to have real data to show us whether or not the assumptions we're making are correct or not. So I guess I don't see it as a key issue in terms of my concerns around the model, but it is a significant issue in evaluating particularly the impact of a particular policy or fishing regime on small stocks that may not be in the model at all.
In terms of the TAM rules and the structure of them currently that are being used, it's hard for me to see that the compensatory issue, which happens at low abundance, would be something you'd be too worried about. The reason being is that the difference between the various alternative TAM models is the cutback point at abundance, and certainly at the low abundance, the model, the way it's structured at the low abundances, that which compensatory processes might be, as have been characterized this morning, might be operating in those abundance or population levels. The prescription would be to do as little fishing as possible. So the policy is to avoid those when you're down in those areas, and the prescriptions that are coming out of the FRSSI process are dealing with when to cut back at much larger abundances than where those compensatory issues are carrying out. I suppose, and I believe that's been done in the past, is one of the sensitivity analysis one could do is to see whether the presence or absence of compensatory construct at the low population sizes affects significantly where the best cutback point might be when the population is in abundance. And my recollection, if that work's been done, it wasn't very sensitive, but I'd have to refresh my memory on what there's been a significant amount of sensitivity analysis been done on the model by the people who are working on it. Some of it's available in reports, and others are in gigabytes of data that I have sitting on my computer that I haven't been able to figure out how to look at.
So if I can put it in layperson's language, would you agree that the compensatory effect is not a particular concern because the model is being used to evaluate harvesting decisions and escapement decisions, and there's already, the interim benchmarks already require no fishing at low levels, so that you're not going to be making a fishing decision that would be impacting or creating a compensatory effect, something like that?
Under the assumption that the compensatory effect is occurring at very low population sizes. Okay. And if we look at the stock and recruitment data from all of these populations, there's very little statistical evidence for that compensatory effect. That's because there's a lot of noise around the data in that lower area. In part, or it may be because it is or isn't there. So, and it's hard to distinguish those alternatives. So,
Mr. Morley?
I mean, I have to actually agree with my colleague, Mr. Wilson, on some of this, because I think that, in fact, the unmodeled stocks, if they're not behaving the same as the modeled stocks, and they're at different population levels when we're talking about the application of these TAM rules, that certainly there could be some impact. But so I think, and the issue here is that we're never going to know because we don't collect enough information on those unmodeled populations to understand that. And although I tend to agree that looking at the overall, what we're trying to do in managing the 4 run timing groups, I would agree with what Mr. Staley is saying in terms of this situation.
All right. You say we're never going to know because we don't collect enough data on the smaller stocks. Is it the case that we collect spawning enumeration data on the very small stocks?
We have some, as I think you went through the other day in terms of looking at stock assessment, that you do collect some visual surveys of all of these populations, but the reliability of the estimates is a lot lower than some of the more accurate methods, and certainly the compensatory impacts would probably be, as Mr. Wilson indicated, perhaps in a lake kind of environment, and you do very little in terms of monitoring what's going on with the ecology in those ecosystems. So that's why I think you're not going to know a lot about it, and we're not putting our monies into looking at some of the smaller populations, which potentially, depending on how the wild salmon policy is implemented, could have a significant impact on how you might want to manage the 95% of the fish that we all are involved in harvesting.
Right now, the FRSSI model, as I think you touched on, Mr. Cass, only models the 19 stocks, for which the department does have stock recruit data. in a long time series. And as Mr. Wilson and you have both noted, there's a number of stocks in the watershed which are not accounted for in those 19 data sets that we have. So what is the mechanism by which FRSSI accounts for those small stocks for which there is no time series for stock-recruit relationships?
Mr. Commissioner, there is a, as I touched on this morning, there is a buffer built into the TAM rule by way that the fixed exploitation rate that's prescribed across a large range of run sizes is in the low range of what the analysis on stock recruit would tell us in terms of productivity and the exploitation that it can withstand. So, in answer to the question, there is a mechanism built in there to guard against overharvest of less productive stocks.
This is the 60% maximum rate?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Wilson, what's your view on this?
Well, the TAM rules apply to aggregates of multiple stocks. So within an aggregate, there may be stocks that are relatively unproductive and stocks that are more productive. I don't think a rising tide lifts all ships equally in this case. Some stocks, for example the Adams, might come back and very strong, and as a result the entire aggregate is fished at 60%, right? Notwithstanding the cultists for the time being. That could lead to a situation in which, because we're only harvesting at 60%, we may have more fish on the spawning grounds in the Adams that we might like. But other stocks would have escapements that are far below the levels that we would like to see to protect them from extinction and to ensure that they're not listed. So it's not clear to me how aggregate escapement goals applied to a mixture of stocks with different productivities necessarily protect the weaker stocks from overharvest.
I think there's two quite different types of stocks we're talking about. One is the ones that are modeled, that are in the current FRSSI model, but are part of an aggregate, and that is being, for which an aggregate TAM rule is being applied. In those cases, it's my understanding that the performance measures that are used to sort of look for inflections on one of the graphs you showed, where the choices of the cutback points, there were slight inflections in those performance measures. Some of those performance measures are the probabilities or likelihoods of individual of the modeled stocks that are in those aggregates falling below some benchmark. So to a certain degree, the existing construct sort of accounts for individual stocks. If your performance measure is that one or two or some individual stocks within the model stocks within that aggregate don't fall below some threshold, and if that's your performance measure, then the TAM rule, appropriate TAM rule, would be obvious from those the kinds of graphs you were looking at earlier. The other issue is the ones stocks that are not represented, and I guess that's there's a couple things you might say to that. One is that the 60%, while albeit a somewhat arbitrary number, it's at the lower range of what, in general, we believe the Sockeye stock's productivity on a coast-wide basis would sustain, at least at some level. Wouldn't those that are still with us now and who are with the have sort of average productivity or recent productivity would probably still be with us after a regime of 60% for some time. That's sort of general rule of thumb. That being said, we've experienced a decline in the productivity, and perhaps the world has changed, and 60% may or may not be still appropriate. But that's related to the. But I think there has to be a distinction between those populations that are not included in the analysis from those that are included in the analysis, because the current analysis does address at least the potential for one or more of the model stocks in an aggregate falling below some benchmark.
Right. Mr. Morley?
I don't have anything to add to Mr. Staley.
So you talked about using a 60% ceiling as a a buffer or to create some protection, what about using a proxy stock? Has that been considered, using a proxy for some of the stocks that we don't have a good time series of data for? Mr. Cass?
We have, Mr. Commissioner, entertained the notion of a proxy stock, which would represent, or the intent was to have it represent a less productive stock, for example. And so the model does have the capability to model proxy stocks with the idea of looking at the impact on that stock, even though we may not have stocks representing that the low productivity that the proxy would be designed to do. It's one way to look at how the model deals with a fictitious stock, if you like, that has the properties of a low productivity stock.
And how would you know what the characteristics of that fictitious proxy stock would be?
Yeah, I mean, that's the rub, of course, is if we don't know what the productivities, the range of productivities are for the full suite of CUs, say, then you're forced to make an assumption about what the proxy should be representing. So, you know, my view is in the range of populations that we're seeing now, you know, cultists falls in the low range with say a mean productivity rate of in terms of exploitation might be 50%. I'd have to look at the numbers. So that might be some lower range that you might want to attach to a proxy stock. And I honestly am not sure where that work has led. I mean, this others may know, others may know about. But I do know that we entertain the idea of a proxy stock, but I'm not sure if it's followed through or continues to be one of the bells and whistles that we have in the current version.
Mr. Wilson? Do you think a proxy stock would be a reliable or a useful way to understand the impacts of the stocks we don't have a full data set on?
Well, I agree with Mr. Cass. The problem is how do you, if you'll pardon the jargon, parameterize this proxy stock? How productive do you think it is, and what is the carrying capacity of its habitat? You have to make some assumption about those things if you're going to put it in the model as a proxy stock. So I think it's a useful way to provide general guidance about what might happen to a stock of any particular low productivity under a long-term fishing regime. But it doesn't necessarily protect you from the downside risk of driving small stocks to extinction if they're not in the model. Your proxy stock will be as productive as you say it is. And since you have no data, you simply have to pick a number. And that's my concern about the whole approach to managing unmodeled stocks within the FRSSI process.
Mr. Morley?
I mean, I agree that the proxy stock will only be as good as the assumptions you put into what the productivity is, so I don't think it's particularly instructive in terms of moving us forward here.
All right, Mr. Staley?
All the caveats that the others have said about parameterizing an unknown stock are appropriate, and but it occurs to me that one of the places, and this may be a piece of work that needs to be done, would be to search for the types of productivity or the levels of productivity of a so-called virtual stock or a proxy stock that would not be sustainable. So how unproductive the stocks have to be that would not sustain the kind of exploitation and mortality that's in some of these TAM rules, such as the 6%. That would be an informative thing to do, and then it would be up to a group of experts perhaps to sort of think broadly about how viable those stocks might be anyway, and that sort of thing. Thank you.
Has any work been done in that respect with this model, or has that been a proposal that's been considered?
That has been, I don't know of any work that's been done with it. I know that was briefly discussed when the capacity of putting a virtual stock in the computer model was discussed. So, but I don't believe any work explicitly on that, and actually it just occurred to me today. So.
We talked about we've talked a few times about the TAM rule, the 60% ceiling. And my question is whether we've talked a little bit about where that came from. Mr. Cass has talked about that. But my question is whether that is an appropriate ceiling in years where there's a very large abundance, like 2010 as an example. And I'll start with you, Mr. Cass.
Well, yeah, you know, I mean, these things, Mr. Commissioner, are case specific, and in the perfect world, I guess, where you knew what the optimal escapement would be, then perhaps you could manage to that. But in the world of mixed stock fisheries, in particular, what we saw in 2010, where cultus, for example, is mixed in with the very abundant late run group, then you have to ask yourself about how you trade the biodiversity, the conservation issue off with a reduced benefit to the harvest sector and a potential for too many fish on the spawning grounds for future production. So there are certainly, the model is can be adapted to constrain escapement at some level. It's the your case-by-case world in mixed stock fisheries that may have impacts other than on the large populations.
Do you agree then that the 60% level should be reassessed then on a yearly basis in relation to the different aggregates to see what is the appropriate ceiling rather than...
I think that is a healthy exercise. I think that research to look more at the where we are now, given the uncertainties, and I think it's worth a review of the cap.
All right. Mr. Wilson?
Well, it's a matter of compromise, isn't it? On one hand, we can fairly quickly evaluate the economic benefit of fish that are killed and harvested and sold. And the future production benefit of putting a spawner on the spawning grounds we evaluate through our view of stock recruit dynamics, the so-called Ricker curves or Larkin curves. But that said, there's also a whole host of benefits that can come from large escapements that aren't captured by the model or evaluated in any way. And by this I'm talking about the nutrification of freshwater ecosystems, the benefits to zooplankton populations, and even salmon. Salmon, in fact, benefit substantially from the nutrients their parents bring to the watershed. And some authors have suggested that both the carrying capacity and productivity of stocks can be influenced by the escapement strategy, in particular by allowing larger escapements to provide nutrients to support the entire ecosystem. Those benefits are not included. But I do agree that it's a conversation around values that we all have to have. So not all values are captured by the models, and not all values are equally well quantified in terms of dollars and cents.
Well, the question was, which your evidence is helpful without doubt, but the question was really whether the 60% is something, is it an appropriate level? Does it provide enough buffer and it should be maintained going forward? Or is it something that should be looked at and reassessed and perhaps changed for the different aggregates in any given year?
I'm not confident that a 60% exploitation rate will protect weak stocks and unmodeled stocks. There is an argument to be made that more than 60% of some stocks in strong years can be harvested without facing a penalty in terms of future production. If your primary focus is yield, then there would be reason to reconsider these TAM rules. If your major objective is conservation of all stocks and protection of weak stocks, there may be times when very large returns should not be harvested at 60%. So I'm struggling with a way to provide a general answer to something that can really only be evaluated in a specific context.
Right. Mr. Morley?
I guess I agree with Ken in the sense that one of the drawbacks to the entire FRSSI model, in my opinion, is that it is trying to develop, it's a simulation model based on sort of looking forward 48 years and applying some very general rules that if you had them in effect for 48 years, that this is what is likely to happen. And that in reality, we don't make decisions on harvest or escapement for 48 years. We make a decision every year based on what is coming back. And in fact, those decisions need to evaluate the consequences of adjustments to that, even within season, depending on the relative strengths of the runs you see coming back. So there are trade-offs to be made of the kind that Ken talked about in terms of evaluating them. But those evaluations need to be done in a dynamic sense as you see the actual, because the trade-off may be very different when you are potentially giving up 10 million fish in order to put an extra 1,000 fish on the spawning grounds for a run that is somewhere in the 20,000 range. But if it's putting an extra 1,000 fish on the spawning grounds in a run that's down to less than 100, maybe it's society's different. There's a different impact there. It's a different weighing of those values, and that can't be done in simple application of a rule for 48 years. And that's one of the drawbacks that I'd like to get into in more detail. The other issue here is that we keep talking about exploitation rates, and we're not. It's a total allowable mortality rate. So our exploitation rates are, given what we're assuming about en route losses and en route mortality, is that our exploitation rates are very much lower than that. In the vast majority of cases, we're not harvesting anywhere near 60%. Okay, right. We're harvesting more in the 30% range, or 30, and sometimes we might get up to 50 if we're really, really lucky, but most times we're way well below 60%.
Could I just ask you if your first comment that you made it's really a reflection on the fact that the FRSSI model creates pre-season harvest rules, and is your comment really that those rules need to be more flexible in season, that you can't, not only can you not project a rule forward for 48 years, but even to make a rule hard and fast in the spring may not be the right rule by the time we're in the end of the summer? Is that the point?
Both cases, I think, are important, that you need to evaluate it based on the expected returns and the makeup of the populations in any given year, what cycle year you're on, those kinds of things relative to, again, the returns that are coming back from all the populations. And even within season, if we set these fixed rules for each of the run timing groups, and again, the relative strengths of the run timing groups may provide a different kind of trade-off decision in the middle of the season than you thought it was going to be at the beginning of the season. And we have been stuck with some fairly inflexible rules in the past that have hamstring and really haven't provided any huge additional conservation benefits to stocks that are at risk, but have certainly prevented some significant harvesting opportunities for all of the user groups.
Mr. Commissioner, I wonder if Mr. Staley could answer this question, and then we'll stop for the break.
Maybe you could repeat the question.
My question was whether 60% ceiling is a ceiling that should be in place even on high abundance years, and I use 2010 as an example.
Well, I think that whatever the cap is, it's currently 60%, is there regardless of the abundance of the. It's there. Its purpose is to protect components or populations that are not abundant and not strong, and which we suspect are there, and we may not have evidence, hard evidence to show, but we suspect there are smaller populations and weaker populations that are mixed in. So I don't think you'd want to change it just because of the run size. In fact, the analysis is done on the assumption that. The analysis includes occurrences of very strong run sizes as well as very weak mixtures in the FRSSI model as it's constructed. That being said, I don't know whether 60% is or isn't the right number. It's a number that was chosen, and I expect it should be reviewed and in an informed way with a fair amount of discussion. But the other side of it is there are, as with the changing nature of the fisheries, there are opportunities to harvest some of these surpluses, for lack of a better word, in places where the mixtures aren't quite as the same or as strong. And so the FRSSI model, unfortunately, only has one fishery in one time, and doesn't represent the sort of the suite of possible responses that a management and that could be used to access unexpected abundances like we had in 2010.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.